Gold participants and listeners from around the world. I'm Kristen Schwartz, licensed midwife and MC here for Gold Learning. And here at Gold, our preparations for the upcoming Gold Midwifery Online Conference of 2020 are in full swing. And as you may know, we like to get together with our speakers beforehand and introduce them to our audience here and chat a little bit about what they're up to and what they're working on and about their background. And with me today is Dr. Ginger Breedlove. Welcome, Dr. Breedlove.
Hi, Kristen. How are you?
Good, thank you. And I'm so happy to have you here today. And we're going to talk about the topic that you're presenting here at Gold, which is titled Postpartum Pause, Identifying Gaps in Preparedness for Parenting. And I want to get to that important topic in just a minute. But before we do that, I want you to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself. You have quite the resume. You have your own consulting company. You were before that on the faculty for 17 years as a professor of nursing and midwifery. And you co-founded the first freestanding birthing center in Topeka, Kansas. And the list goes on and on and on. This is just so fascinating and impressive. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure, Kristen. I have been in maternal child health 2 years as a labor and delivery nurse, and the remainder of my career, 40 some years, as a nurse midwife. And one of the exciting things I think that has formed my opportunities and uh, career path is starting in a freestanding birth center in Kansas in the late 70s when they really weren't common in the US, and also having four sons with two born at that birthing center, one born in my home and one in a hospital where I was the chief midwife of a large midwifery service. So it's exciting to bring personal experiences into your professional career and how that forms your beliefs and your passion.
Absolutely. That birthing center, that first one that you created there, I can imagine that, it's now when you're looking back, it looks exciting and wonderful to create that. But I can imagine this was not easy always, right? I mean, there were probably quite some barriers for you at that time.
There were barriers, and what's exciting is although the ownership has changed, that birthing center is still there 40 some years later.
Oh,
It's important to know that at least in our country, barriers are have really not changed in terms of how important it is to have diverse partnerships and educate all the stakeholders. Um, it's an important part of change. So. It's a lot actually of what I do in my current work as a consultant in scaling up and sustaining midwifery.
yeah. Tell us a little bit about your consultancy work. That sounds also very interesting.
Sure. We have now finished our second year. We sort of describe our work in buckets with a lot of our work focusing on individual midwives, systems of care, so hospitals, health organizations, and practices, whether those are physician or midwife owned. And our hope is to provide expert resources between myself as a past president of the American College of Nurse Midwives and my partner, a past president of the American Association of Birth Centers, to be able to provide best evidence and resources and sometimes our own on-site services to really help again, identify what the barriers are and how to navigate them in order to really grow midwifery in our country.
Interesting. So tell me a little bit how that would work if a midwife, let's say I would come to you and what do you often see? What are the struggles that providers are coming with
Yeah,
and
we
want
do a
answers?
lot of work on one-on-one coaching related to contract and employment negotiation.
Ah,
So getting paid your worth. We
mm,
do a fair amount of coaching on how to navigate difficult employment situations where you feel uncomfortable approaching the higher powers that be about challenges within the work environment. We help practices grow so
mm,
that they can expand their current service line. Um, I'm even working on consulting with the University of Tennessee to start a new midwifery education program. So we do really a wide variety of services if it fosters
Hmm.
um, the recognition and advancement of midwifery.
The recognition and advancement of midwifery. How wonderful. Yeah. And all the best for that new program there at the University of Tennessee. That sounds fascinating too.
Yeah,
And speaking of university, you were also a professor for quite some time, a professor of nursing and midwifery, right? So tell us how that, you were in clinical practice, now you're a consultant, and you were also professor. That's such a well-rounded, resume right there. So tell us how you taught students, I mean, obviously at university, but so, tell us how you bridge that, coming from clinical skills and then going into academics there.
sure. The first part of my career, 25 years, was in full scope midwifery practice, both in the freestanding birth center for 14 years and then in a hospital-based practice that I initiated in Kansas City. We grew to about 10 midwives, and that practice diversified in the greater Kansas City area when the University of Kansas received significant funding to start a graduate midwifery program. So I left clinical practice to go start and become the director of the midwifery education program. That experience for 10 years really laid the foundation for growing midwives in the Midwest of our country,
Hmm.
an area where midwives weren't quite as prevalent as the East and West Coast. So becoming an educator was new for me, right? Going from
Yeah.
high volumes, full scope clinical practice into teaching about the same time I completed my PhD. And it was wonderful to bring midwifery into a very large school of nursing where it's kind of an unidentified profession. So not only was I working with our graduate midwife students, but with undergraduate OB lectures for new nursing students as well as doctoral students, and the School of Medicine working with residents in a free clinic um, taking care of women's health GYN needs. So it was really a great opportunity to take clinical practice into the realm of academia and try to constantly make the educational format meaningful so that what you're teaching
Yeah.
isn't just psychomotor skills, but the why
Yeah.
behind how midwives do what they do.
Absolutely. That sounds great. Well, thank you for sharing that. And then also something I'm very excited about that you did, you co-founded the March for Moms. That is just spectacular. That is so wonderful. And we had Dr. Neil Shah with you at our one of our last conferences here. And tell us about the March for Moms. This is just such a wonderful program.
Sure. I'll try to condense a long story into a couple minutes here. But as I was leaving as president of ACNM, I was allowed to invite our keynote speaker, and I invited Neil Shaw in the spring of 2016. He was, and he knows I say this, wasn't quite on the national, international scene yet, uh, but he was becoming noted, and he spoke on C-section and design of institutional settings. We have the opportunity as our executive board of ACNM to invite the ACOG presidents that are at our meeting to a private dinner, which we had 3 ACOG presidents that year. And I asked one of them that I became friends with, Dr. John Jennings, what he thought about inviting Neil Shaw to that private dinner. And he goes, "Oh, we'd love to meet him. We don't know him. We heard his presentation. It was pretty interesting." So Neil came to that private dinner, and he sat between Dr. Jennings and I. And when John was president of ACOG, his goal was to try to get 1 million moms on the mall, but it didn't come through as the ACOG 1 year project that has to be approved by their board. Instead, he did a great collaborative team-based book. So Neil starts listening to John talk about getting 1 million moms on the mall. Neil, who we don't know, says, "Oh, we could do that." So this young obstetrician, half our age, makes a comment. We finish our wine, everybody leaves, and the conversation's over. In October, a few months later, I spoke on a panel at the American Association of Birth Centers, and a pre-conference session on legislation talked about the barriers to improving maternity care in the US. So this was before maternal mortality hit the media in
Mhm.
2016.
Mhm.
I came home angry, frustrated at 40 some years of maternal child health and said to my husband, this is nuts. I'm either going to leave this and just completely retire or something has to be done.
Right.
And he goes, well, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I remember this guy talking about how easy he thinks it would be to have a rally for moms in the mall. And what do you think if I just find out if John Jennings was serious and see if that guy, Neil Shaw, would be interested? And literally in about 24 hours, I had contacted some key leaders in our country, including Neil, and they all said, let's go for it. So we had our first rally on Mother's Day in 2017 in DC, and really the rest is history. It's an amazing collaboration, getting groups out of their silos and coming together on key advocacy. And we're confident that the movement really has elevated maternal health in our country.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful work you're doing there and co-founding this amazing organization, all the lives you're impacting with that as well. So let's talk about the presentation now that you have here with us, the postpartum pause. Tell us a little bit about what you will be speaking about here.
Sure. One of the things that's happened, Kristen, is we have our first grandchild who's a little over 2 years old, and another just born less than 2 weeks ago.
Oh,
But
congratulations.
sort of, thank you. The reason for this sort of new passion of mine is related to how my oldest son, who saw the birth of all his siblings, experienced their early parenting weeks with his wife, a bit dismayed, feeling vulnerable,
Mhm.
not having in the moment assurances that everything was fine, in their case with the baby, not so much the mom, and learning as a mother-in-law, right? I have 4 sons, it's a very different relationship,
Right.
that this mom was struggling. And so I looked for everything I could find in my detective ways online about on Amazon of early parenting in the first few weeks and found nothing other than it being embedded in chapters of classic books. So I went to Amazon on the UK and I found more than I could believe on the parenting in the early weeks, ordered one without ever reading it, had it mailed to my daughter-in-law and she read it cover to cover. And I realized then, after talking to her, when I would say, well, what about uric acid crystals in the diaper? Or what about how the baby relaxes after a feeding? And she would respond, this is someone with a master's degree in accounting. Nobody told me about that,
Right. Right.
which is the title of the book that 15 other co-authors wrote with me in response to her and many of her friends' experiences that came to a focus group at our house. So between the experiential reality of these are people in my family who make average incomes, who in this case are college educated, who
Mhm.
went to healthcare providers I referred them to, although not a midwife, and delivered in the hospital, who come out not feeling confident, but in
Mhm.
fact afraid.
Right.
There's
Yeah.
a major gap here in
Right.
what providers and our communities are offering families, and the deny and delay
Uh-huh.
of seeking care is causing preventable death
Right.
or consequences related to childbirth. So it is a crucial issue not only in our
Yeah.
country but around the world to recognize what's going on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for presenting on that. And you are so right. I mean, I can speak here from my own experience before becoming a midwife. When my first daughter was born, I had visited every childbirth class. I read the books. I thought I was really well prepared, but I never had held a newborn before in my life. Everybody else either didn't have children or they had older children. I was just not exposed. So I thought I was prepared coming home. I had no idea, there was from how
Yeah.
my body changes to the hormones to
Right.
everything that was going on. And I feel now, even as a care provider, we're doing such a good job with being on top of the pregnancy, with trying to make sure that we give good education to our families. But then they have the baby, and often then our care ends, right? And I feel like, what
That's
happens
right.
to them next? Who's
That's
who's
right.
caring for them when those hormonal changes are happening? Who's caring for them when the baby cries and they don't know how to calm that crying
Yeah,
baby? And it's such a big issue, and we see that in
it
postpartum
is.
depression. We see that in maternal suicides or parental
Right.
suicides. It's not only the moms who suffer, right?
That's right.
So I'm very excited that you will shine the light there in your presentation. And you also, the book you spoke about, that you wrote, you are giving some copies away, right, for our gold listeners as
Yes.
well, right?
I'll be sending you 10 copies to give away.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for that, and I know our listeners will appreciate that as well. And Dr. Breedlove, before I let you go, I know you and I chatted a little bit before this recording, before we got together here, and you mentioned you have a big trip coming up. Just tell us a little bit about that before I let you go.
Sure. I was just formally invited to go to Germany the first week of April to present to the European military armed forces professionals on three topics related to maternity care for military healthcare providers. So we'll be talking about maternal mortality, postpartum health, how to collaborate on a team to improve care, and hopefully give them some resources to help the military families they serve.
Fantastic. And I hope you get back to us and let us know how everything went.
Thank you.
But before that, we have you, of course, at the Midwifery Conference here at Gold 2020, and that is coming up pretty quickly here. And the presentation will be live on February 18th. So we see you then.
Fantastic. Thank you both.
Thank you so much, Dr. Breedlove. And to our listeners here, I just mentioned the presentation will be live on February 18th. For more information on this presentation and the other presentations in the conference, please visit goldsmidwifery.com. You'll find information there on the other speakers and all the presentations there and when they're being held in your time zone. And I hope I see you at the conference then. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Bye bye, everyone.